The howling January wind sliced through Montana's Bitterroot Valley like a frozen blade, carrying with it nature's fury in the form of relentless snow. Jack Morrison's hands trembled on his camera, not from the cold but from what he had just witnessed through his telephoto lens. He had been tracking a herd of elk, hoping to capture their silhouettes against the twilight sky, when the roar of an approaching pickup truck shattered the pristine silence. Through his viewfinder, he saw it, a sight that would haunt him forever. 3 tiny shapes in one larger form being ruthlessly hurled from the truck's bed into the deepening snow. Subscribe to witness an extraordinary tale of survival, where one man's encounter with abandoned bears leads to an unexpected journey of healing and hope. In 27 years as a wildlife photographer, Jack had documented both the savage beauty and cruel realities of nature, but this was different. This was human cruelty, raw and deliberate. The truck's taillights disappeared around a bend, leaving only tracks in the fresh snow and the echoing sound of its engine. His heart pounded against his ribs as he lowered his camera, its memory card now holding evidence of an unthinkable act. "Dear God," he whispered, fumbling for his satellite phone. His fingers, usually steady enough to capture perfect shots of birds in flight, now shook as he dialed emergency services. But looking at the furiously falling snow, he knew help would come too late. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and those shapes, those bears, wouldn't survive the night without immediate intervention. The decision made itself. Jack grabbed his emergency kit from his truck, the one Emma had always insisted he carry. Emma, his late wife, would have already been halfway to those bears, veterinary kit in hand, giving him that look that meant, "What are you waiting for?" 5 years since cancer took her, and still, she guided his conscience. The wind howled louder as he trudged through knee-deep snow, his headlamp cutting a weak path through the darkness. His breath came in white puffs visible in the beam of light. 20 yards from where he'd seen them fall, he heard it, a low, pained moan that made his blood run cold, not from fear, but from the raw anguish in the sound. The mother bear lay on her side, her fur dusted with snow, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. Around her, 3 cubs, no more than a few months old, huddled against her bulk, whimpering. Their eyes, when they turned to him, reflected his headlamp's beam like tiny frightened stars. "Easy there," Jack murmured, his photographer's instinct warring with his human compassion. These weren't his usual subjects, meant to be photographed from a safe distance. These were desperate creatures needing immediate help. The mother bear's eyes met his, and in them, he saw something that stopped him cold, not wildness, but a terrible awareness of their situation. He knew the risks. A wounded bear protecting her cubs could be deadly, but as he watched, she only pulled her cubs closer, her eyes never leaving his face. She was too weak, too injured to fight, or perhaps, some part of him wondered, she recognized help when she saw it. Moving slowly, Jack pulled out his satellite phone again, this time calling Dr. Sarah Chun, the wildlife veterinarian who had helped him document the rehabilitation of injured wolves last spring. "Sarah, I need you now. I've got 4 bears, mother and cubs, dumped in the snow. We're about 15 miles north of your sanctuary on Route 12. Through the static, Sarah's voice crackled with urgency. "Keep them warm, Jack. I'm coming. Just keep them alive." The next 40 minutes were a blur of desperate improvisation. Jack pulled emergency blankets from his kit, approaching the bears with slow, deliberate movements. The mother's eyes tracked him, but she made no aggressive moves as he carefully draped the blankets over her and her cubs. He talked continuously, his voice low and soothing, the way Emma had taught him to speak to injured animals. "You're going to be okay," he promised, though his heart clenched at the mother's labored breathing. "Help is coming. Just hold on." One of the cubs, braver than its siblings, stretched its nose toward his gloved hand. The simple gesture of trust nearly broke him. The sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the wind. Headlights painted the snowy scene in harsh relief, and Jack heard a car door slam. Sarah's voice called out, "Jack, where are you?" "Here," he shouted back, never taking his eyes off the bears. "Bring the tranquilizers and hurdles. They're alive, but the mother's badly hurt." As Sarah and her team worked to stabilize and transport the bears, Jack stepped back, raising his camera almost unconsciously. Through his lens, he captured the scene: dedicated humans working in the darkness and swirling snow, fighting to save 4 lives that someone else had deemed worthless. The mother bear's eyes found him one last time before Sarah's sedative took effect, and in that moment, Jack made a decision that would change not only his life but the lives of countless animals to come. He looked down at his camera's display, at the image of the truck dumping its innocent cargo. Tomorrow, this story would reach the world, but tonight, these bears needed him. As he helped load them into Sarah's heated transport vehicle, his mind was already racing with plans. His remote property, the one he'd retreated to after Emma's death, could become something more than a photographer's hermitage. "Jack." Sarah called from the driver's seat, her face etched with concern. "Are you coming?" He nodded, climbing into the passenger seat. Behind them, under warm blankets and medical monitoring equipment, 4 bears clung to life. 4 bears that would become the first residents of what Jack was already thinking of as the Morrison Wildlife Sanctuary. Emma would have liked that name. Sarah's wildlife sanctuary glowed like a beacon in the Montana darkness, its lights cutting through the relentless snowfall. Jack helped her team rush the bears into the emergency treatment area, his camera forgotten in its case as more urgent needs took precedence. The mother bear's breathing had grown more labored during the journey, and one of the cubs had stopped shivering, a dangerous sign. "Get me the warming blankets and start 4 fluids," Sarah ordered her team, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her shoulders. "Jack, help me with the cubs. We need to check them for internal injuries." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she examined each tiny body, her face betraying nothing of the anger Jack knew she must be feeling at their condition. The smallest cub, barely bigger than a house cat, whimpered as Sarah gently palpated its abdomen. Jack found himself murmuring softly to it, the same way he used to when Emma would bring injured animals home. "You're safe now, little one. We've got you." Under the harsh medical lights, the full extent of their condition became clear. The mother bear's leg was indeed broken, with compound fractures that would require extensive surgery. Her body was marked with older scars and signs of malnutrition. The cubs, though younger, showed similar signs of neglect. "They've been kept in captivity," Sarah said grimly, preparing a syringe of antibiotics. "Probably by someone who thought they could make money breeding them. When it got too difficult." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew how that story ended, on a snowy road in the middle of nowhere. Hours passed in a blur of medical procedures and careful monitoring. Jack found himself assigned the task of bottle feeding the cubs, who were too young to eat solid food consistently. The brave one, who had reached for him earlier, proved to be the most demanding, batting at the bottle with tiny paws when Jack wasn't quick enough. "That one's got spirit," Sarah remarked, pausing in her work with the mother bear. "What do you want to call them?" "They'll need names for the medical records." Jack studied the cubs as he fed them. The brave one, with its distinctive brown patch around one eye, seemed to demand a strong name. Maverick, he decided. This little fighter is definitely a maverick. The smallest cub, still curled against its sleeping mother, became Scout. The middle cub, who watched everything with intelligent eyes, he named Ranger. And their mother? Sarah asked, checking the foredrip. Jack thought about the trust in those eyes when he'd first approached her in the snow. Grace, he said softly. Her name is Grace. Sarah nodded approvingly. Grace it is. She's going to need every bit of it to get through the surgery tomorrow. She hesitated and added, Jack, you should go home. Get some rest. This is going to be a long journey for them. But Jack shook his head, settling into a chair near the recovery area. I'll stay. They shouldn't wake up alone. He didn't say what they both knew, that he hadn't truly slept in his empty house since Emma died anyway. As the night deepened, Jack found himself talking to the bears, sharing stories of his adventures in wildlife photography. He told them about the time he spent 3 weeks tracking a wolf pack through Yellowstone, about the orphan moose calf he helped rehabilitate last spring, about Emma and her endless compassion for every creature that crossed her path. Dawn was breaking when Grace stirred, her eyes opening slowly. She immediately sought out her cubs, making a soft sound of distress when she couldn't reach them. Jack moved the sleeping cubs closer, placing them where she could see and smell them. The relief in her eyes was unmistakably human. The surgery team will be here soon, Sarah announced, returning from a brief rest. She looked at Jack, noting his exhausted but determined expression. You're going to stay, aren't you? Wild bears wouldn't drag me away, Jack replied, managing a small smile at his own joke. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Jack paced the hallway, alternating between caring for the cubs and checking on Grace's progress. Sarah's team worked meticulously, placing pins and plates to rebuild Grace's shattered leg. Through it all, Jack couldn't shake the image of those bears being thrown into the snow. He couldn't forget the casual cruelty of it. When Sarah finally emerged from surgery, her scrubs spotted with blood but her eyes bright, Jack knew before she spoke that Grace had pulled through. She's a fighter, Sarah confirmed. The next 48 hours will be critical, but I think she's going to make it. That afternoon, as Jack watched Grace slowly wake from anesthesia, her cub safely nestled against her under careful supervision, he made a decision. His property, with its 100 acres of pristine wilderness, could be more than just a refuge for one photographer's grief. It could be a sanctuary, a place where animals like Grace and her cubs could heal and recover. I want to help, he told Sarah, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. Not just with these bears, but with others. My land, it's perfect for rehabilitation. We could build proper facilities, create a real sanctuary. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then smiled. Emma would be proud, she said simply. And you're right. We need more safe places for cases like this. But Jack, it won't be easy. The permits alone. I've got time, Jack interrupted, watching his maverick, the bravest cub, paw gently at his mother's nose. And thanks to my last book advance, I've got resources. These bears, they're just the beginning, aren't they? There are more out there needing help, Sarah nodded soberly. More than you know. But Jack, are you sure? This would mean completely changing your life. Jack thought about his empty house, about the years he'd spent hiding behind his camera lens since Emma's death. He thought about the trust in Grace's eyes when he found her in the snow, about the way Maverick reached for him, about the countless other animals out there facing cruelty and abandonment. "My life could use some changing," he said finally. "Emma always said I had a gift for connecting with animals. Maybe it's time I use that gift for something bigger than just taking their pictures." Outside the recovery room window, the Montana snow had finally stopped falling, and the first rays of sunlight painted the wilderness in shades of gold and promise. 3 weeks passed in a blur of permit applications, construction plans, and round-the-clock care for Grace and her cubs. Jack's property began its transformation from a photographer's retreat to a wildlife sanctuary. The sound of hammers and saws filled the crisp mountain air as local contractors, many working at reduced rates after hearing the bear story, constructed the first rehabilitation enclosure. Sarah visited daily, monitoring Grace's recovery with cautious optimism. The mother bear's strength grew steadily, though her injured leg would likely never be quite the same. What amazed Jack most was her intelligence, the way she seemed to understand that the humans around her meant help, not harm. She took her medications without resistance and allowed the medical team to check her healing wounds, all while keeping a watchful eye on her cubs. "She's remarkable," Sarah commented one morning, watching Grace guide Maverick away from trying to climb the enclosure walls. "Most rescued bears take months to show this level of trust. It's almost as if she knows we're on her side." The cubs were thriving under their mother's care. Scout, the smallest, had grown into a curious explorer, often following Jack around the enclosure during his daily maintenance visits. Ranger maintained his thoughtful demeanor, carefully observing everything before acting, and Maverick lived up to his name, constantly testing boundaries and keeping Grace busy with his adventures. Jack found himself spending more time with the bears than behind his camera these days. His publisher had been surprisingly supportive when he called to explain his new project, even offering to help promote the sanctuary through his next book. "Document this journey," his editor had said. "People need stories of hope right now." One particularly cold morning, as Jack approached the enclosure with breakfast, he found Grace standing at the fence, watching him with those intelligent eyes. She made a soft huffing sound, her typical greeting now, and moved closer, her limp less pronounced than it had been even a week ago. "Morning, beautiful," Jack said softly, beginning his daily routine of distributing food and fresh water. As he worked, he talked to her, something that had become habit. "The new medical building should be finished next week. Sarah's already lined up 3 more cases, 2 orphan black bears and an injured grizzly. Looks like you're going to have neighbors soon." Grace listened, as she always did, while keeping one eye on her cubs. Maverick was attempting to teach Scout how to climb a log pile, while Ranger watched from a safe distance. The sight made Jack smile, reminding him of the photographs he'd taken yesterday. Images that showed nothing of the trauma these bears had endured, only the joy of family and recovery. The sanctuary's development had attracted attention beyond just the local community. Wildlife officials, impressed by the professional setup and Sarah's involvement, fast-tracked several of their permits. Conservation groups reached out, offering support and resources. But most importantly, tips about the truck that had dumped the bears began coming in. "We might have a lead," Sheriff Bennett told Jack that afternoon, stopping by to check on the construction progress. A similar vehicle was reported near a suspected illegal breeding operation in Idaho. "We're working with their authorities to investigate." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening at the thought of other animals suffering similar fates. "Keep me posted," he said. "And Tom," he added as the sheriff turned to leave, "thank you for taking this seriously." "Hard not to," Bennett replied, glancing at the bear's enclosure where Grace was now leading her cubs through their daily exercise routine, Sarah's prescription for strengthening her injured leg. Seeing them now, knowing where they came from, makes a man want to believe in second chances. Those second chances were becoming the sanctuary's unofficial mission. Word spread through wildlife rehabilitation networks, and soon Jack's phone rang constantly with calls about animals needing help. Sarah helped him prioritize cases and design specialized enclosures, while local volunteers, many of them retired or with flexible schedules, offered their time and skills. Emma's presence seemed stronger than ever as the sanctuary took shape. Jack found himself remembering her dreams of creating a place where injured animals could heal, her detailed plans drawn up during long hospital nights, when hope was all they had left. Now, watching Grace guide her cubs through their recovery, those dreams were becoming reality. The transformation wasn't just physical. Jack noticed changes in himself too. The heavy silence that had followed him since Emma's death was gradually filled with purpose. His photographs, once focused solely on capturing nature's untouched beauty, now told stories of resilience and healing. Each image of Grace and her cubs showed progress, not just in their physical recovery but in their growing trust and confidence. One evening, as spring's first warm breeze carried the scent of melting snow, Jack sat by the enclosure, reviewing construction plans for the next phase of development. Grace approached the fence, settling down nearby with her cubs sprawled around her. The sight struck him suddenly, how far they'd all come from that desperate night in the snow. "You know something, Grace," he said quietly, watching Maverick attempt to sneak up on his sleeping siblings. "When I found you that night, I thought I was saving you, but I'm starting to think maybe it was the other way around." Grace's eyes met his, filled with that same trust he'd seen in the snowstorm. She made a soft sound, almost like agreement, before turning her attention back to her cubs. Ranger had woken up and was now teaching Scout a new game involving pine cones, while Maverick bounded between them, adding his own chaotic energy to the mix. The sound of approaching footsteps made Jack turn. Sarah stood there, holding a stack of medical charts and smiling at the scene before her. "Ready to start planning for our new arrivals?" she asked, settling down beside him. "The black bears will be here next week, and we'll need to modify the protocol based on what we've learned from Grace." Jack looked at his notepad, already filled with ideas and observations. "You know what Emma used to say about setbacks?" he asked, remembering his wife's favorite saying. "She'd tell her patients that healing isn't just about getting better, it's about getting stronger where you were broken." Sarah nodded, watching as Grace led her cubs in what had become their evening routine, a careful patrol of their enclosure's boundaries, teaching them the confidence they'd need when it was time to return to the wild. "Well," she said softly, "I'd say that's exactly what's happening here for all of you." Spring burst across the Montana wilderness in a riot of color and new life, transforming Jack's sanctuary in ways he hadn't imagined possible. The bears' enclosure, once stark and functional, now bloomed with native plants carefully selected to mimic their natural habitat. Grace had taken to teaching her cubs which vegetation was edible, a sight that drew regular crowds of fascinated visitors and researchers. The sanctuary's reputation grew with each successful rehabilitation case. The 2 orphan black bears, sisters found abandoned near Yellowstone, were thriving under Grace's unexpected mentorship. She would watch them from her enclosure, making soft vocalizations that seemed to calm them during medical procedures. The injured grizzly, a massive male they named Atlas, was healing well after surgery on his damaged paw. "She's become quite the ambassador," Sarah remarked one morning, Watching Grace demonstrate berry-picking techniques to her cubs while the black bear sisters observed intently from their adjacent enclosure, I've never seen anything quite like it. She's not just recovering, she's helping others recover too. Jack nodded, adjusting his camera to capture the moment. His latest photo series documenting the sanctuary's development had caught the attention of National Geographic. They wanted to run a feature on animal rehabilitation, focusing on Grace's story as a symbol of hope and resilience. The State Wildlife Board is coming next week, he told Sarah, lowering his camera as Maverick successfully plucked his first raspberry. They're considering us for official partnership status. It could mean more resources, more animals we can help. The sanctuary had evolved far beyond Jack's initial vision. Local schools organized field trips, teaching children about wildlife conservation through Grace's story. University researchers requested permission to study the bear's rehabilitation process. Even the legal system had taken notice. Their documentation of Grace's injuries and recovery had helped strengthen the case against illegal animal breeding operations. But it was the small moments that meant the most to Jack, like watching Scout, once the timid cub, confidently exploring new enrichment toys, or seeing Ranger teaching his younger siblings the proper technique for fishing in their pool. And especially observing Maverick, who had appointed himself unofficial greeter to any new arrivals at the sanctuary. One particularly memorable afternoon, as Jack was showing a group of potential donors around the facility, Grace did something unexpected. She approached the fence line, carrying a branch laden with berries, and carefully placed it where the young black bears could reach it. The visitors gasped at this display of apparent altruism. "That's extraordinary," whispered Dr. Helen Martinez, a renowned wildlife behaviorist who had flown in from California to observe the sanctuary's methods. "This level of interspecies cooperation, it challenges everything we thought we knew about rehabilitated bears." The sanctuary's success brought challenges too. Managing the increasing number of rescue requests while maintaining quality care for their current residents required a careful balance. Jack found himself grateful for Emma's meticulous organizational skills, which he had absorbed during their years together. Her old veterinary notebooks, filled with observations and treatment protocols, became valuable references as they developed their rehabilitation programs. Construction continued on new facilities. The medical building, now fully equipped thanks to community donations and grants, hummed with activity. Sarah had hired 2 additional veterinarians to help manage the growing number of cases. Local contractors, inspired by the sanctuary's mission, often worked weekends to complete new enclosures. "Remember when this was just going to be a temporary solution?" Sarah teased one evening as they reviewed plans for an expanded rehabilitation area. "Now, look at it. We're practically running a wildlife hospital." Jack glanced out the window at Grace's enclosure, where the mother bear was leading her cubs through their evening exercises. Her limp was barely noticeable now, though Sarah said she'd always carry that reminder of her past. Somehow, it made her more remarkable, the survivor who had turned her trauma into strength. "Emma always said everything happens for a reason," Jack replied, his voice soft with memory. She would have loved seeing this place come to life. The sanctuary's impact rippled beyond its fences. Local authorities reported a decrease in wildlife-related incidents as public education programs raised awareness about human-animal conflict. Other rehabilitation centers reached out for advice on implementing similar programs. The Grace Protocol, as their rehabilitation method became known, was drawing attention from wildlife experts across the country. One morning, as Jack made his rounds, he found Grace watching the sunrise from her favorite spot near the pond. Her cubs, nearly twice the size they had been when rescued, played nearby. Maverick was attempting to teach the Black Bear sisters a new game involving rolling logs, while Scout and Ranger supervised with what looked remarkably like older sibling exasperation. "You've built quite a family here," he told Grace, settling down to document the scene through his lens. He captured moments that would have seemed impossible that snowy night. Grace, once broken and afraid, now strong and nurturing, her cubs no longer fighting for survival but thriving and teaching others. The sanctuary itself had transformed from a place of healing into a center of hope. The sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of the State Wildlife Board. Jack stood, brushing off his jeans and preparing to guide another tour. But before he left, he turned back to Grace. "Ready to help me show them what second chances look like?" Grace's response was to gather her cubs, positioning them perfectly for the wildlife official's first impression. As Jack led the group toward the enclosure, he heard several gasps of amazement. The scene before them said more than any presentation could. Grace and her cubs, healthy and confident, surrounded by blooming wildflowers and the evidence of their successful rehabilitation. "This is extraordinary," the board chairman murmured, watching Maverick demonstrate his berry-picking skills to his attentive audience of Black Bear sisters. "When we heard about a photographer running a bear sanctuary, we were skeptical. But this is something special." Jack smiled, remembering Emma's words about healing being a journey shared by both caregiver and patient. The sanctuary had become more than a refuge for injured wildlife. It was a testament to the power of compassion, a place where broken spirits found not just healing, but purpose. As he began the tour, Jack caught Grace's eye one last time. In her gaze, he saw the same quiet strength he'd witnessed that first night in the snow. They had come so far from that desperate moment, building something neither of them could have imagined. And somehow, he knew this was just the beginning. Summer painted the sanctuary in vibrant hues as Grace's cubs grew stronger each day. Their once uncertain future now bloomed with promise. The State Wildlife Board's approval had opened new doors, bringing resources and opportunities that transformed Jack's modest sanctuary into a leading rehabilitation center. But it was the day the FBI arrived that marked the turning point none of them had anticipated. Agent Rebecca Torres stood at the observation point, her eyes fixed on Grace and her cubs as they demonstrated their natural foraging skills for a group of visiting researchers. "Your documentation of their injuries, combined with other evidence we've gathered, helped us crack open a multi-state wildlife trafficking ring," she explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. The operation that had Grace wasn't just breeding bears, they were supplying exotic animal dealers across the country. Jack's hands clenched involuntarily, remembering that snowy night and the casual cruelty of the truck disappearing into the darkness. "How many animals?" he asked. "Dozens," Rebecca replied. "But here's where you come in. We're going to need specialized facilities for the rehabilitated animals. Your sanctuary's success with Grace is exactly the model we need." The implications of her words hung in the air. Expansion on that scale would mean more than just new enclosures. It would require a complete transformation of the sanctuary's operations. Jack watched as Maverick, now nearly full-grown, gently showed a recently rescued bear cub how to crack open logs for insects, a skill he'd learned from Grace. "We'll do it," he said firmly. "Whatever these animals need." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Sarah coordinated with wildlife officials across 3 states, preparing for the influx of rescued animals. The sanctuary's volunteer base swelled as word spread through the community. Local businesses donated materials and equipment, while university students arrived to help document the rehabilitation processes. Grace's role in all this continued to amaze everyone who witnessed it. She had become what Sarah called a rehabilitation mentor, her calm presence and nurturing instincts helping traumatized newcomers adjust to their temporary home. Even more remarkably, her cubs had inherited this gift for healing. "It's extraordinary," Dr. Martinez commented during her weekly observation session. Maverick, in particular, seems to understand exactly what each new arrival needs, whether it's space, playful interaction, or just quiet companionship. The sanctuary's success stories began attracting national media attention. A documentary crew arrived to film Grace's family, capturing moments that brought their journey full circle. Footage of the cubs, once tiny and traumatized, now confidently teaching survival skills to other rescued bears, moved viewers to tears and open checkbooks. But it was the smaller, quieter moments that touched Jack most deeply, like watching Scout, who had once been too afraid to leave his mother's side, now patiently coaxing a frightened cub from its hiding place, or seeing Ranger demonstrating proper hibernation den-building techniques to a group of adolescent bears. His methodical nature was perfectly suited to teaching. One evening, as the setting sun painted the mountain peaks in gold, Jack found himself sitting by Grace's enclosure, Emma's old journal open in his lap. The pages were filled with her dreams for a place exactly like this, a sanctuary where healing went beyond just physical wounds. "You'd be proud of them," he said softly, watching as Grace supervised the evening activities of her extended family. "They've turned their pain into purpose, just like you always said was possible." Sarah joined him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "The lab results came back from the latest rescues," she reported. "They're all showing signs of improvement, especially the ones we housed near Grace's enclosure. It's like she emanates healing." The sanctuary's impact rippled far beyond its fences. Local schools incorporated wildlife conservation into their curriculum, using Grace's story to teach empathy and environmental responsibility. Law enforcement agencies consulted with them on animal welfare cases. Other rehabilitation centers sent staff to learn their methods. "We're changing the way people think about wildlife rehabilitation," Sarah mused, watching as Maverick organized what looked like a game of hide and seek with the younger bears. "It's not just about physical healing anymore," she continued. "It's about emotional recovery, about rebuilding trust." The FBI's case progressed, each new revelation confirming the importance of their work. More rescued animals arrived, each with their own story of survival. The sanctuary expanded but never lost the personal touch that made it special. Jack made sure every animal received individual attention, following the example Grace had set. One morning, as Jack reviewed construction plans for the new rehabilitation units, he heard excited calls from the observation area. Racing over, he found a group of researchers clustered around the viewing window, pointing animatedly at Grace's enclosure. Through his camera lens, he captured a remarkable scene. Grace was teaching a group of recently rescued cubs how to fish, demonstrating the careful palm movements needed to catch trout in the enclosure stream. Her own cubs watched from nearby, occasionally stepping in to help guide the younger bear's attempts. It was a perfect picture of healing coming full circle, survivors becoming teachers, trauma transformed into wisdom. "This isn't just rehabilitation," Dr. Martinez said, her voice thick with emotion. This is regeneration. These bears aren't just surviving, they're thriving, and they're helping others thrive too. The sanctuary's latest addition, a surgical center specializing in wildlife orthopedics, was nearing completion. Named the Grace Wing in honor of their first patient, it would offer hope to countless more injured animals. Jack stood in the doorway of the new building, remembering that desperate night in the snow that had started it all. A familiar huffing sound made him turn. Grace stood at her enclosure fence, watching him with those wise eyes that had seen so much. Her cubs, though they could hardly be called cubs anymore, were spread throughout the sanctuary, each contributing in their own way to the healing of others. "Look what you started," Jack told her softly. "One act of trust in the snow, and look what it's become." Grace's response was to gesture toward the new arrival's enclosure, where Maverick was patiently teaching young bears the sanctuary's daily routine. Scout supervised the feeding program with gentle attention to each animal's needs, while Ranger methodically demonstrated survival skills to the rehabilitation candidates. The sanctuary had become more than just a place of healing. It was a testament to the transformative power of compassion, a living proof that even the deepest wounds could become wells of hope for others. As Jack watched Grace's family continue their work of healing, he knew that Emma had been right all along. Sometimes the greatest purpose can grow from the darkest moments, if only we have the courage to trust and the patience to let healing unfold in its own way. A year had passed since that fateful night on the snowy road, and the Morrison Wildlife Sanctuary was hosting its first annual Hope and Healing celebration. The autumn air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as supporters, volunteers, and wildlife officials gathered to commemorate not just Grace's journey, but the hundreds of animals who had found healing within these fences. Agent Torres stood at the podium, her usual serious demeanor softened by the occasion. Thanks to the evidence gathered here in the sanctuary's documentation, the wildlife trafficking ring has been completely dismantled. 17 people are facing federal charges, and more importantly, hundreds of animals have been rescued and rehabilitated. Jack watched from the side of the stage, his camera capturing the moment. Behind him, in the expanded rehabilitation complex, Grace and her family continued their daily routines, unaware that they were the guests of honor at this gathering. Maverick had grown into a magnificent adult bear, his distinctive personality now focused on mentoring the sanctuary's most challenging cases. Scout's gentle nature had made him the sanctuary's unofficial welcoming committee for new arrivals, while Ranger's methodical approach to teaching survival skills had become legendary among the staff. Sarah joined Jack as the applause died down, her eyes bright with emotion. "Did you ever imagine that night in the snow that we'd end up here?" He shook his head, remembering the desperate fear and anger he'd felt watching those shapes being thrown from the truck. "I was just trying to save 4 bears," he said, gesturing at the sanctuary now spanning over 300 acres, with specialized rehabilitation facilities, a state-of-the-art veterinary hospital, and a research center dedicated to wildlife recovery. The celebration continued as the sun painted a Montana sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Visitors toured the facilities, marveling at the natural enrichment areas and the innovative rehabilitation techniques that had become known as the Grace Method in wildlife circles. Dr. Martinez's latest research paper documenting the extraordinary success rates of their peer-to-peer rehabilitation program had been accepted for publication in leading scientific journals. But the heart of the sanctuary's success stood in the original enclosure, where Grace continued her work with quiet dignity. Through the observation windows, visitors watched in amazement as she demonstrated maternal care to a group of orphaned cubs. Her own children, now working alongside her in different areas of the sanctuary, had inherited that same gift for healing. "We've had requests from 5 different countries to implement our rehabilitation model," Sarah told Jack as they watched Grace at work. "Your photographs in our documentation have changed how people think about wildlife rehabilitation. It's not just about physical healing anymore. It's about emotional recovery, about rebuilding trust and teaching survival skills through example." Jack raised his camera, capturing the moment when Grace gently guided a frightened cub toward the feeding area. Her movements were slow and purposeful. The trust in the young bear's eyes reminded him of that first night of Grace's own journey from victim to healer. The FBI's case had led to sweeping changes in wildlife protection laws. The Grace Act, as it came to be known, strengthened penalties for animal trafficking and provided funding for rehabilitation facilities nationwide. Jack had testified before Congress, sharing Grace's story and the sanctuary's success in helping traumatized animals recover. As evening approached, the celebration moved to the new education center, where a wall of Jack's photographs told the sanctuary's story. Grace's journey was documented from that first desperate night to the present, each image a testament to the power of resilience and compassion. "Emma would have loved this," Martha Wilson, Jack's longtime neighbor, said softly as she studied the photos. "She always said you had a gift for healing, even if you couldn't see it yourself back then." Jack smiled, remembering his late wife's determination to help every injured creature that crossed their path. "She would have been right in the middle of it all," he said. "Probably running the whole show better than I do." The sanctuary's success had brought unexpected personal healing as well. The empty farmhouse that had once echoed with grief now bustled with activity. Volunteers, researchers, and staff filled the rooms with purpose and energy. The property that had been his refuge from the world had become a place of connection and hope. As the celebration wound down, Jack made his final rounds for the night. He stopped at Grace's enclosure, where she sat watching the sunset, her presence as regal as ever. Her cubs, now fully grown and serving as rehabilitation mentors themselves, were scattered throughout the sanctuary, each contributing to the healing of others in their own unique way. "You know, Grace," he said softly, "when I found you that night, I thought I was saving you. But really, you saved me. You showed me that healing isn't just about surviving, it's about transforming pain into purpose." Grace turned to look at him, her wise eyes reflecting the same trust he'd seen in the snow that night. In the distance, Maverick's distinctive call echoed as he settled his charges for the night. Scout's gentle presence could be sensed in the calm that pervaded the rehabilitation areas, while Ranger's methodical teachings had prepared countless bears for successful returns to the wild. The sanctuary had become more than just a place of healing. It was a testament to the transformative power of compassion, living proof that even the deepest wounds could become wells of hope for others. Each animal that passed through their gates carried a piece of Grace's legacy, the understanding that survival was just the beginning. True healing meant becoming strong enough to help others heal too. As darkness settled over the Montana wilderness, the sanctuary's lights glowed warmly in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals needing help, new stories of survival waiting to be transformed into tales of triumph. But for now, in this moment, Jack stood in the peace of what they had built together. A place where second chances weren't just given but multiplied, where healing wasn't just a destination but a journey shared. Grace's soft huffing sound drew his attention back to her. She was watching a group of new arrivals settling into their enclosure, her posture alert but calm, still every inch the guardian and teacher she had become. In her eyes, Jack saw the future of the sanctuary reflected, an endless chain of healing and hope, started by one act of kindness on a snowy night, now reaching far beyond anything they could have imagined.